Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Session 1 of Conducting Knowledge Audits. In Session 1, we're going to take a brief walkthrough of auditing and knowledge audits in particular, and we'll talk about why we want to do a knowledge audit. Specifically, in this section, we're going to talk about capital and its role in a knowledge in any kind of an economy, and more particularly the role of knowledge capital in a knowledge economy. We're going to distinguish between an audit and a maturity assessment. In the knowledge management literature, you will find these two terms used interchangeably, and in fact, they are quite different tasks. We're going to talk about the purpose of an audit, and we're also going to talk about what we're auditing, different kinds of knowledge assets and intellectual property. So let's begin with a discussion of knowledge capital in a knowledge economy and the role of capital in an economic system in general. The term capital has several meanings, and it is used in many different business contexts. In general, capital is accumulated assets or ownership. More specifically, capital is the amount of cash and other assets owned by a business. And notice the focus here on assets. These business assets include things like accounts receivable, equipment, land, buildings, etc., anything that's owned by the business. Capital can also represent the accumulated wealth of a business in terms of its assets minus its liabilities. So from an economic perspective, capital assets are produced goods that are used in the production of goods and services. So in an economic system, capital is the primary means of generating wealth. Control and proper management of capital is tied directly to wealth creation. Capital assets are different from other kinds of assets because they generally constitute what we call a durable source or stock, which is not significantly used or consumed. Rather, it's invested in, we invest in these assets to create other things. So the purpose of capital is basically, it's a stock of inputs, but it's not inputs that are consumed on the same basis as other types of resources. Capital is an input to the production process, whatever it is that an organization does to create value for its stakeholders. From an accounting perspective, when we use capital assets in the production process, we may depreciate them as consumption will tend to wear them down over time. For instance, land and physical capital is an input to the agricultural production process. It contributes directly to the production of agricultural products and services. So when we talk about capital, what are some characteristics of capital? Well, it is used in the production of other goods and services. It is not used up immediately in the process of production. For example, if you were to produce bread, you would use wheat to make each loaf of bread. Wheat would not be considered capital. The machinery that you use to make the bread would be considered capital. And this may seem like an odd characteristic, but it is something that has already been produced. So machinery has been built already. So it's already a formal product, or it's a good. And it's generally, as we said, it's a durable good in that it lasts many years. So physical capital, which is primarily what we've been talking about up till this point, would include things like factory equipment, all the computer infrastructure of a company, the buildings, office furniture, anything that has a life expectancy of several years. It's used as a primary input into producing the organization's products and services. Financial capital includes things like the organization's financial stock. It's not necessarily its receivables and payables, but it's financial reserves. So financial capital is invested in initiatives, in experimental products, services, etc. But it's not necessarily what you're consuming each day to produce your goods and services. I'm hoping this is making sense. Okay, so that's a general a very brief context for understanding what we mean by capital. Capital is something that the company wants to protect because it's a stock, it's a major resource. Andreessen, and if you've taken some other knowledge management courses at Kent State, you will be familiar with Daniel Andreessen's model of intellectual capital. Andreessen identifies three forms of capital: tangible capital or physical capital, intellectual capital, and financial capital. We talked a little bit about the tangible or the physical capital and the financial capital, only briefly. But our primary focus in knowledge management is intellectual capital. So Andreessen defines three broad categories of intellectual capital, such as human capital, structural capital, and relational capital. And you'll notice that he breaks down those three categories into 8 additional categories. This is the kind of capital that we're interested in when we focus on a knowledge audit, because this is essentially the landscape for knowledge assets. Okay. So intellectual capital is the stock of human knowledge. It's structural knowledge, it's relational knowledge. In order to succeed in the 21st century knowledge economy, organizations must invest in, manage, and grow their intellectual capital. In the 21st century, knowledge and intellectual capital will be the most important capital assets that an organization can possess. In order to manage your intellectual capital, you have to have a baseline understanding of what you have. This is where the audit begins to come in. Managing intellectual capital assets is critical, but it's very challenging. And it's challenging because intellectual capital assets are resident in people, in communities, and in organizations. You manage them by managing an environment in which there are incentives to replenish and incentives to keep a good stock of intellectual capital and to replenish that intellectual capital. You also want that intellectual capital to remain relevant to the economy in which it's being used. As we mentioned earlier, capital assets are generally assets which have a lifespan of several years. And organizations in GAAP, GAAP, the generally accepted accounting principles, will have guidelines for the accepted lifespan of different kinds of assets. Intellectual capital assets are a little bit more challenging to audit than physical or financial assets because they're what we call intangible. We can't really see them. We can't always put our hands on them. And in addition, these kinds of capital assets have quite a long lifespan. They may be expensed over anywhere from 5 to 40 years. So there are many challenges in terms of auditing intellectual capital assets. Another significant challenge is valuing these assets. That's another thing that we typically do when we conduct an audit. The main challenge in auditing intellectual capital is that unlike physical or financial capital, the value of intellectual capital is never static. We may have invested in a computer infrastructure. We may have networks. Okay. So we know what the value of those assets are because we can look at the current price of those, and then we can amortize it over time. The challenge with intellectual capital, though, is that it's always relative to the environment and the context. If you assign a value to it in 2011 for your organization, and there's a major advance in the field outside your organization, the value or relevance of your intellectual capital may decrease. So both the nature and the value of your intellectual capital assets need to be audited on a routine basis. In other words, the challenge is to decide which of these assets are business critical. So of the 8 categories of intellectual capital assets that we identified in Andreessen's model, and that would be the groupings under human capital, structural capital, and Relational capital. Which do you think are most important to your organization, and why would you think this? We're going to talk about what we're auditing, different kinds of knowledge assets and intellectual property. So let's begin with a discussion of knowledge capital in the knowledge economy and the role of capital in an economic system in general. The term capital has several meanings, and it is used in many different business contexts. In general, capital is accumulated assets or ownership. More specifically, capital is the amount of cash and other assets owned by a business. And notice the focus here on assets. These business assets include things like accounts receivable, equipment, land, buildings. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Session 1 of Conducting Knowledge Audits. In Session 1, we're going to take a brief walkthrough. We're going to distinguish between an audit and a maturity assessment. In the knowledge management literature, you will find these two terms used interchangeably, and in fact, they are quite different tasks. We're going to talk about the purpose of an audit, and we're also auditing and knowledge audits in particular. And we'll talk about why we want to do a knowledge audit. Specifically in this section, we're going to talk about capital and its role in a knowledge in any kind of an economy, and more particularly the role of knowledge capital in a knowledge economy.